reading from Genesis. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, to whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son, but God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And she sat opposite him, and she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. This is the word of the Lord.
A Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge in the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going. In the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward. At once before and after, seeking now that can breed futures. Like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk. For by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. And when the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. And when our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we will never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. And when we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it's better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. This poem out of Audre Lorde's book, The Black Unicorn, is concerned with marginalization. It's meant to be a form of prayer in a way of one speaking out to a crowd, sharing their heartfelt words to community, and to God. In this poem, we see oppressed groups emerging from their silence, as well as empowering and restoring themselves with a new understanding that though we were not meant to survive, may we speak, may we love, may we rise, may we sit with the sun. Though we were never meant to survive, may we still live. It seems, in a way, this is a litany that Hagar exudes from her story, that from the moment of her beginning in the story of Genesis 16, she was never meant to survive. Her life never really mattered to those who had power over her. See, it's chapter 16 where we meet Hagar, where we find that Hagar has been impregnated by her master without consent. And through this, she runs to the wilderness as child is leaping within her, as child is kicking. She knows that he's going to be a wild one. She's in the wilderness not knowing what else to do or where else to go. She goes and she sits, and this is where she names God, the one who sees. The one who sees me when my own masters will refuse to see me or hear me or look after me, that beats me and abuses me, that you are a God who sees. And through some chapters, we get that Ishmael is born and all seems to be okay. And then Isaac hits the scene. And everything changes for Hagar and Ishmael. In the words of Rachel Held Evans, you may think a prophecy of struggle and strife would dishearten this mother. But this enslaved woman does not struggle or strive. She only obeys, hoping that the prophecy is true, that though she isn't free, her child would be. But Isaac shows up. Isaac, who was meant to show up, that we knew was going to show up because we've read beforehand and knew all the things happening in the text. And the text literally says that Ishmael and Isaac are roughhousing, and Sarah, who's already been annoyed by Hagar's presence, gets more upset. And she sends them out. And Hagar goes to the place that she knows already. She goes to the wilderness, but this time not expecting to see God and not expecting God to see her. She places her child under a bush and she moves back just because she couldn't sit with him as he dies. She goes back to the wilderness. And the same God that saw Hagar is the same God that hears Ishmael. It's actually what his name means. God hears. The old folk growing up used to sing the song, "Trouble in My Way." I have to cry sometimes. I lay awake at night, but that's all right because after a while, I know God's going to fix it. I know God's going to hear me. In the same places of Hagar, in the midst of what trouble she sees, in the midst of what trouble Ishmael is about as he sits under a bush, God hears his cry, and God remembers the prophecy that he gave in Genesis 16. that in the place of wilderness, God is compassionate. God shows mercy. God shows love. God shows grace. God shows up to see and to hear when the rest of the world refuse to do so. It's the place of provision for Hagar. It's the place that becomes Ishmael's home, that he grows to be a man, that he grows to be a great nation of the Ishmaelites. That later in the text we find out that he becomes the father-in-law of Esau. That his story is still intertwined with the rest of the story. But notice right before Hagar leaves to go to the wilderness, Sarah is deeply disturbed. Deeply disturbed on who she is. As if Hagar had any choice in the decisions that Abraham and Sarah made over her. And yet in the midst of their wrong, in the midst of Abraham and Sarah's shame, they take their anger out on the one who is hopeless and helpless in the situation. The two filled with power and privilege, the two knowing what is right in God's eyes, but still decided to venture out on their own. This first family paves a way that we see generation after generation after generation through Genesis of some of the same behavior. And yet in many of those same stories, we see what is evil and wrong being called in their mind righteous. The two have power to put an end to their choices, and yet they don't advocate to change the story. It's almost as if they too knew that Hagar was never meant to survive, but that she was only to live for their desires. When we read such stories as this, it's easy to feel heartbroken and seeing that way back when. Yet we sit in 2023 with laws that still regulate women's bodies and try to find what decisions they can and can't make. We still sit in 2023 with 18% of published American cases with 2 steps away from slave cases. And where lawmakers have recently said, it's important and good for us to keep those slave laws. Why? Someone asked them. Just in case. We sit today still with this story looming and pervading society that is still passed through generation of generation of a privilege and a power that sits upon another. The story of Hagar is still a story of today. And as one study asked a group of individuals, who do you characterize with when you read the story of Genesis 16 and Genesis 21? 1% of the group said Hagar. The rest said Abraham and Sarah. And this characterization fails to see the implication of power and privilege that supersedes another's life. Or maybe that's what people did see, and that's why they chose Abraham and Sarah to be of power. Rabbi Daniel Ruttenberg states that this is the story of being so attached to our own needs attached to our own wants that we forget who else might be hurt along the way. This is the story of us being oblivious to the ways in which we wield our influence. While Sarah and Abraham are wrong here, they are still our ancestors. And in many ways, we are meant to identify, even as uncomfortable as it may be. It's a story that reminds us to scrutinize our actions, to think of the ways in which we have been blind to the power we have abused. I'm thinking in the ways in which our privilege has caused us to bring suffering to others. It's a passage that causes us to have a mirror to see within ourselves, to realize that we too have wielded power and privilege over another, even when we may not have meant to, even when we may not have seemed to have done it, that we must too look within ourselves and see where have we missed the mark, to stop the story, to stop the continuation through generation after generation after generation. Because it's not just about God seeing us and God hearing us, but also we turning our ear to community and seeing and hearing. And while I may not be a Calvinist, I need to put that out there before I make this statement. Calvin once stated that Christians should always be a disturbance to the social order to some degree, because they may unmask the injustice of society in which they live, or even unmask the injustice within themselves. To take the word of God seriously. This story causes us to see within ourselves. It causes us to see where past has missed the mark, and hopefully present and future can begin to be a restorative, active change. That while the picture that was painted before may have been about exclusion or without or to push or to oppress, that the picture that we continue to paint over and over throughout time begins to be something different. A story where when we read Abraham and Sarah, that we don't just overlook chapter 16 and 21 as just some bad case that they did, but actually take to heart. One way this was done, of changing our past to moving us to a new future, was through the artwork of Wally. I'm sure many of you all know Monument Ave in Richmond, Virginia. I like to remember it as the big statue where Arthur Ashe is standing there beating children with his tennis racket. A few years ago, a new monument was placed in the ground where Confederate veterans lived their final years. 2 blocks from Stonewall Jackson on his horse, next door to the Daughters of the Confederacy, stood Rumors of War, designed and sculpted by Wally. He came there to the Fine Arts Museum in 2016, and he continued every day to walk up and down Monument Ave. And something just didn't sit right with him. For several days, he couldn't get the monuments off of his mind. And 2 years later, he approached the curator and said, I have something in mind that I would like to do. And so on December 10th, 2019, He stood in front of 5,000 people, standing in the rain, wearing a colorful African print suit and Converse. And while he spoke to the group of people there, and he said, I saw some extraordinary sculptures. The work was magnificent. People took a lot of time to make something powerful, beautiful, elegant, but also menacing and oppressing. And he said, we can do better. He continued that it is time to appropriate the images of the past and update them for a new era. There's something moving in the culture. There's something changing in the winds. And I'm tired of dysfunction. I'm tired of strife. And let us move forward for the picture in which we are together creating that includes us all. And so he unveils this rider upon a horse with dreadlocks, wearing Nike shoes. But far off, it looks just like one of the Confederate monuments until you get up close and see that it's a different story. It's a different change in the culture. It's a different meaning. It's a different design. That it's a resistance and a disruption. A calling out to what was, and a calling to what we can do that's better, that's greater, that does not oppress. It's a calling for us to do some inward conviction and ask the question, what ways are we needing to change within? In what ways will this change the present and the future of our world? Amen.